Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, InaneDragon, and tonight we're going after that great, scary, conversation-ending term, white fragility. Never heard about white fragility? Then you must not take interest in issues of race in the United States and perhaps even Europe. Or you've had your head under one hell of a rock for the past few decades. Seriously, this term has gained insane popularity in the past few years, especially as a means of discounting anything a white person or an assumed white person has to say about racism and race policy in the United States. Think I'm wrong? Then maybe you haven't even read the paper that coined the term. White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, published in a peer-reviewed journal, which I'm sure proponents in favor of the term will assume is a journal of sociology or psychology. You'd be wrong. Antagonists of the term, I'm betting you're hoping this means that it was published in a race studies, a gender studies, or other pseudoscience journal. Well, you're kinda sorta wrong. White Fragility was published in all things in the International Journal of Critical Pedagogy. What is critical pedagogy? Well, pedagogy itself is the study of how people learn and methods of teaching. And critical pedagogy applies critical theory, which is the foundation for race studies and gender studies, to pedagogy. As I'm still researching critical theory and so can't speak to it in any kind of meaningful way, I'll set all of that aside for this video. What is relevant to me is that DiAngelo's hypothesis is not accepted or used to any significance in either psychology or sociology. I couldn't find any reference to her works in even a single significant journal of psychology or sociology. Nevertheless, let's start our investigation with DiAngelo's original work. As I've mentioned, this term dates back to DiAngelo's 2011 publication, White Fragility, wherein she coins the term, defines it, and explains all of the psychology necessary to understand it. So what is white fragility? According to DiAngelo, it is when any amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, producing defensive reactions from a white person. DiAngelo conceptualizes this as a lack of social stamina that results directly from what she calls white people's racial insulation, which they possess by being the dominant culture and thus seeing themselves as the default in society. In reaction to such intolerable stress, DiAngelo posits that white people will react with anger, fear, and guilt, arguing with the person who caused the stress, going silent, or leaving the situation entirely. Since DiAngelo does not define what she means by argumentation in the paper, we cannot know if she is referring to any disagreement or only disagreement which is couched in fear and anger. Most of DiAngelo's article walks through her ideas of how and why white fragility, as she defines it, exists in America. It takes for granted that white fragility exists rather than supporting its existence with well-reasoned argumentation from a basis in carefully gathered evidence. By her own admission, DiAngelo begins all of this from assumptions about society rather than evidence-driven models of society, with the statement, whiteness studies begin with the premise that racism and white privilege exist in both traditional and modern forms, and rather than work to prove its existence, work to reveal it. If this is intended to be an explanatory model of reality, she has already rendered the concept unfalsifiable from the outset, which would allow us to dismiss it here and now. Worse still, she gathers no data, performs no experiment, and verifies nothing about her hypothesis within the paper. While she has extensive citations, this is not because white fragility is a meta-analysis. Overwhelmingly, the citations are not papers from relevant fields of science such as neurology, biology, psychology, or sociology. Rather, they are provided to establish the definitions of terms, frame her justification for the presumed causes of white fragility, and apparently to bulk up the works cited section of the paper so that it looks better. Again, we could dismiss the entire paper out of hand at this point. Worse still, at least one of her most relevant sources, Discursive Management of Resistance to a Multicultural Education Program, is used inappropriately by DiAngelo. Discursive management is used to defend her claim that white people are resisting challenges to internalized dominance. However, the paper actually contends that members of every ethnic group react negatively to mandatory lessons on multiculturalism, cultural sensitivity, and diversity. A close reading of the paper shows that the students, regardless of ethnicity, employed similar reasons for resisting such classes, often because of what appears to be shared values of objectivity and individualism. Ironically, these values are two of the factors that DiAngelo claims reside within whites that, when challenged by minorities, cause them to experience white fragility. The entire paper, cited by DiAngelo to support her idea, is a repudiation of the very idea that DiAngelo is proposing. Most of the rest of the papers and books that I could lay hands on were small case studies, personal anecdotes, or essays. This is not the foundation on which to build an empirical claim that is the beginning of being treated as a serious psychological concept among lay persons. This is the foundation for, at best, a hypothesis to be researched in depth by sociologists and psychologists. This bit is going to be a bit more opinion than data-driven, since we're getting into why I think the very concept of white fragility, as presented, is a bad idea. First, if we flip the script and wrote this up as black fragility, the author would rightly be accused of gaslighting. Disagreement to a particular narrative, one that takes its core premises for granted, is treated as being incapable of handling the issue, rather than honest disagreement. Hostility at being told that as a white person they are incapable of responding rationally to discussion of racial issues is reasonable, especially when to disagree with claims made about them based on their skin color is treated as evidence that they're too fragile to discuss the matter. Second, as hinted at earlier, the whole thing is based on assumption and assertion with no follow-up testing. The testable hypothesis with predictions about what will happen in specific conditions isn't even developed in the paper. Sure, you could argue that it predicts a white person will react emotionally or argumentatively to a racial discourse. However, this suffers from being too vague. At this level, I could claim anything other than passive acceptance of any claim made by the champions of white fragility on racial issues to be confirmation of white fragility. It's circular argumentation mixed with a dab of self-fulfilling prophecy. So, okay, we'll modify our prediction. People from white ethnic groups will demonstrate a lower tolerance for discussion of race than members of non-white ethnic groups. Except that we've already introduced one study, Discursive Management, cited by DiAngelo in her own paper, that directly contradicts this narrative and prediction. Which leads into what I stumbled over while looking for research that builds off of or tests DiAngelo's white fragility concept. Serious, peer-reviewed, and repeatable research into the idea that in-group, out-group bias creates mentally draining tension when encountering new people from an out-group, and that in America this tension can be massively agitated by talking about and emphasizing race in advance. The research linked below discusses how everyone has some problem engaging in out-group interactions, at least for the first few minutes of meeting a new person who isn't immediately recognized as part of an in-group. All of the factors that DiAngelo attributes to white fragility are equally explained by this in-group, out-group tension and are present in every ethnic group, particularly in a discussion where members are primed to think in terms of their group memberships. What's particularly interesting is that the source of this tension appears to be from efforts not to evade this out-group member, but by consciously attempting to create a positive encounter and good first impression on each other. That's right, by focusing on race, both sides consciously try to avoid being racist and end up frustrated, ruining the conversation. The words of Morgan Freeman come to mind. In the final analysis, DiAngelo's white fragility is a statue made of clay with feet of bullshit. Everyone gets stressed out and agitated by being forced to focus on a sensitive topic, especially in those situations where they need not be relevant. But since there are many areas where race remains a significant issue in even the most modern nations, the key seems to be being compassionate enough to recognize a charged topic that will get into the deep-seated psychological concept of in-group, out-group relationships, so shelve the accusations on both sides. Recognize that whether or not a system disproportionately affects one group, that doesn't make members of another group automatically your enemy. Shelve the collectivism. Treat each other like fellow humans, each of us with a unique history and a unique knowledge set, will do far more than any pseudoscience about one race not being able to handle talking about race. Give it a try. You might make more progress if you assume concerns and criticism are genuine instead of attempts to avoid the conversation. I'm InaneDragon, and this has been InaneExplanations White Fragility. If you've enjoyed this inanity, subscribe for more of the same. I always want to learn more, so please leave your comments down below and share the video around to get as many viewpoints as possible into the conversation. If you really want to hear me ranting about all kinds of crap and want me to do so with better equipment, consider becoming my patron over on Patreon, link in the description. Thank you all, and have a good night.